February 2nd, 1943. Joseph Stalin stood in his Kremlin office, holding a decoded message that had arrived minutes earlier from the Stalingrad front. The German Sixth Army had surrendered. All of it. 91,000 men, including 24 generals and one field marshal, walking into captivity through the frozen ruins of a city that no longer existed. He read the message twice, then placed it carefully on his desk, his face betraying nothing to the aide who had delivered it. What Stalin said in that moment, according to those present, was almost nothing. He nodded once, dismissed the aide, and returned to the papers on his desk as if the greatest German defeat of the war was merely another item checked off a list, but his hands, witnesses later recalled, trembled slightly as he lit his pipe. For a man who had spent 18 months convinced that everything he had built might collapse into ashes, silence was perhaps the only adequate response to salvation. The Stalin who received news of Stalingrad's fall was not the Stalin who had existed 18 months earlier. To understand what this moment meant, you have to go back to the man he had been when the world was ending. June 22nd, 1941. The day Germany invaded, Stalin had effectively vanished. Not physically, but psychologically. For 11 days, he withdrew to his dacha, speaking to almost no one, appearing to his inner circle as a man in shock. When Molotov and others came to bring him back, they found him slumped in a chair, looking, as one later described, like a hunted animal. His first words, they claimed, were defensive, almost paranoid. "Lenin founded our state, and we've fucked it up." This was the Stalin of the catastrophe, the man who had purged his officer corps, dismissed intelligence warnings about the German attack, and now watched his armies disintegrate. In the first 3 weeks, the Red Army lost more than 3 million men, killed, captured, or missing. The Germans advanced up to 40 miles per day in some sectors. By September, Leningrad was encircled. By October, German troops could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. The Stalin who emerged from that initial paralysis was a different creature than the confident dictator of the 1930s. He was frantic, suspicious, desperate. His orders to commanders on the front reflected a man trying to stop a flood with his bare hands. "Not one step back" wasn't just a slogan, it was the howl of someone watching everything slip away. Officers who retreated were shot. Soldiers who hesitated were shot. Entire units that failed to hold positions were decimated by their own barrier troops. The penalty for defeat was death. Because Stalin believed the alternative was the death of everything. His conversations with his generals during this period, recorded in various memoirs, show a man oscillating between rage and something close to panic. When Zhukov told him Moscow might have to be abandoned, Stalin's response was to threaten him with execution. When commanders reported German breakthroughs, he would sometimes refuse to believe them, insisting they were exaggerating or lying. Other times, he would call them cowards and demand impossible counterattacks with non-existent reserves. The winter of 1941 brought the first hint of hope. The Red Army counterattacked outside Moscow, pushing the Germans back. But Stalin misread what this meant. He believed the Wehrmacht was broken, the total victory was within reach. He ordered offensives all along the front, spreading his forces thin, trying to win the war in one massive stroke. The result was disaster. The Germans held. Then, in the spring of 1942, they attacked again. The summer of 1942 was, in many ways, worse than 1941. The Germans drove into the Caucasus, toward the oil fields Stalin desperately needed. They pushed toward the Volga, toward Stalingrad. And Stalin, watching this unfold, issued Order Number 227 on July 28th. "Not one step back" became official doctrine. Penal battalions were formed from men accused of cowardice. Blocking detachments were positioned behind regular units to shoot anyone who retreated. The order was explicit. Panic mongers and cowards must be destroyed on the spot. This was the language of a man who believed he was losing. Not just battles, but the war. Not just the war, but everything. The Soviet Union, the revolution, his own life, all of it circling the drain. His conversations with Churchill and Roosevelt during this period were increasingly desperate pleas for a second front, for more supplies, for anything that might take pressure off the Eastern Front. He accused them of deliberately letting the Soviets bleed. He raged at delays. He suspected betrayal everywhere. Then came Stalingrad. The battle began in August 1942 as a German attempt to capture the city and cut Soviet access to the Volga. It became something else entirely. The fighting devolved into a block-by-block, building-by-building, room-by-room nightmare. The Germans pushed the Soviet defenders back to a strip of land along the riverbank, sometimes only a few hundred yards deep. Stalin's orders to the 62nd Army defending the city were characteristically blunt: hold or die trying. But something was happening that Stalin didn't advertise. While the Germans were grinding themselves down in Stalingrad's ruins, Soviet planners were preparing something unprecedented. Zhukov and Vasilevsky came to Stalin in September with a proposal. Let the Germans exhaust themselves in the city, then launch a massive counteroffensive to encircle them, not just push them back. Encircle them. Destroy them. Stalin's response to this plan revealed how much the disasters had changed him. The old Stalin might have dismissed it, might have demanded immediate counterattacks, might have purged the generals for suggesting something so ambitious. But this Stalin, the one who had watched his armies shattered again and again, listened. He asked questions. He studied maps. He was learning, painfully, to trust military expertise over his own instincts. The planning took months. Over 1 million Soviet troops were assembled in secret, along with thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. The Germans, fixated on capturing the last blocks of Stalingrad, noticed nothing. On November 19th, the counteroffensive began. The operation, codenamed Uranus, was devastatingly simple. 2 massive Soviet forces attacked the weak Romanian armies guarding the German flanks north and south of Stalingrad. Within 4 days, they met behind the German 6th Army, trapping over 250,000 men in a pocket. Stalin received the reports of the encirclement with what witnesses described as visible relief. Not celebration, not triumph. Relief. As if a man who had been holding his breath for 18 months could finally exhale. His response was to order the pocket held shut at all costs and to reject any German attempts to break out or break in. The 6th Army would be destroyed, not driven back. This was the new Stalin, thinking not just about survival, but about annihilation of the enemy. The Germans tried to relieve Stalingrad. Field Marshal Manstein launched a desperate offensive in December, getting within 30 miles of the pocket before being stopped. Stalin personally oversaw the Soviet response, calling commanders multiple times per day, demanding updates, ordering reinforcements. But there was a difference now. He was no longer panicking. He was prosecuting. Inside the pocket, the German 6th Army was dying. Supplies ran out. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero. Soldiers starved. The Luftwaffe's airlift failed to deliver even a fraction of what was needed. By January, the situation was hopeless. Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a gesture that was really an order. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus was expected to fight to the death or kill himself. He did neither. On January 31st, 1943, he surrendered. The next day, the last German resistance in Stalingrad collapsed. Stalin's public response came on February 23rd, Red Army Day. His speech, delivered to a packed hall in Moscow, was carefully calibrated. He called Stalingrad the beginning of the fundamental turn in the war. Not the end, not victory, the beginning of the turn. He praised the Red Army, the workers, the partisans. But he also warned against dizziness from success, a phrase he had used before to caution against overconfidence. What's remarkable about this speech is what it reveals about Stalin's transformation. He was confident enough now to claim a turning point, but cautious enough to hedge it. He had learned through catastrophic losses that overconfidence killed. The Stalin of 1942, who had ordered impossible offensives after the Moscow counterattack, was gone. This Stalin understood that winning battles and winning the war were different things. But privately, according to those close to him, Stalin's mood had fundamentally shifted. He began sleeping better. His rages became less frequent. He started joking occasionally, something he had rarely done during the desperate period. He began planning not just how to survive, but how to win and what would come after winning. His behavior toward his generals changed. Zhukov, who had been threatened with execution in 1941, was now consulted regularly and given significant autonomy. Rokossovsky, who had been tortured in the purges and only released when the war started, was promoted to command a front. Stalin was learning to delegate, to trust military expertise, to recognize that his instincts were not infallible. The spring of 1943 brought another test. The Germans prepared a massive offensive at Kursk, trying to regain the initiative. The old Stalin might have ordered a preemptive attack or refused to believe intelligence about German intentions. This Stalin listened to his generals, who recommended a defensive strategy. Let the Germans attack into prepared positions, bleed them dry, then counterattack. Stalin approved the plan. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the largest tank battle in history. The Germans threw everything they had at the Soviet defenses and broke themselves against them. Then the Red Army counterattacked, beginning the liberation of Ukraine. This time, there was no doubt. The tide had turned. Stalin's May 1, 1943 speech reflected his growing confidence. He declared that the threat of enslavement had been removed from the Soviet people. He spoke of the Red Army's growing strength. He even allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, noting that the Germans had been forced onto the defensive, but he still cautioned against underestimating the enemy, against assuming victory was inevitable. What Stalin said in private during this period, recorded in various memoirs and documents, shows a man thinking beyond mere survival. He began discussing post-war borders. He started planning how to ensure Soviet security after Germany's defeat. He thought about spheres of influence, about buffer states, about making sure the Soviet Union could never be invaded like this again. His relationship with Churchill and Roosevelt evolved. Where before he had been desperate and pleading, now he was demanding and calculating. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Stalin arrived as an equal, representing a nation that was now clearly going to be on the winning side. His conversations there were about dividing the post-war world, not about begging for help to survive. But the paranoia never entirely left. Even as the Red Army pushed west, even as victory became certain, Stalin remained suspicious. He suspected his allies of trying to make a separate peace with Germany. He suspected his own generals of becoming too popular, too powerful. He suspected returning Soviet prisoners of war of being contaminated by exposure to the West. The man who had learned to trust enough to win had not learned to trust completely. The transformation was incomplete in another way too. The brutality that had characterized his leadership during the desperate period didn't disappear with success. Penal battalions continued to be used. Barrier troops continued to shoot retreating soldiers. Entire ethnic groups suspected of collaboration were deported. Victory didn't make Stalin merciful, it made him vindictive. By 1944, as the Red Army crossed into Poland and then into Germany itself, Stalin's confidence was unshakable. He spoke of the inevitable triumph of the Soviet system. He planned the occupation of Eastern Europe. He prepared for the Cold War even before the Hot War ended. The man who had nearly collapsed in June 1941 was now thinking about Soviet domination of half of Europe. What Stalin said when the war finally turned in his favor was, in the end, less important than what he did. He learned, he adapted. He went from a dictator whose instincts nearly destroyed his country to one who could step back enough to let competent people win the war. He went from defensive panic to offensive calculation. He went from fearing annihilation to planning conquest. But the cost of that transformation was measured in millions of lives. The Stalin who emerged victorious from the war was more effective than the Stalin who had entered it, but he was no less ruthless. He had learned to win, but he had learned nothing about mercy. The final irony is that Stalin's moment of greatest vulnerability, when his regime nearly collapsed, forced him to become the leader the Soviet Union needed to survive. The purges, the paranoia, the rigid control that had nearly doomed the USSR in 1941 had to be partially relaxed for victory to be possible. Stalin had to stop being fully himself to save what he had built. On May 9, 1945, when Germany surrendered, Stalin gave a radio address to the Soviet people. His words were brief, almost understated. He announced victory.